Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We are here to present on the future of UX evaluations and have that conversation with you. We are from Immersion Group. I am Shaunei Gerber. I'm head of marketing at Immersion Group and a UX professional as well.
I'm Geoffrey and I'm head of digital as well as a UX strategist.
And Immersion Group is a niche global experience design, human-centered experience design consultancy. We're based in Gerber with offices all over the world. We have an office based in London, as well as a partner network that stretches across Europe, Bangalore, etc. And ideally what we do is we create memorable experiences for our clients, building stronger relationships with their customers. So today we're joining you guys. We really want to have a conversation around the future of UX evaluations. So the question we have is, what does the future of usability evaluation hold? So we know that UX evaluations remain crucial to every experience. We know this because of the benefits of early testing. We know to avoid unnecessary spend later on. We also know the benefits of early demonstrators to encourage honest criticism. We also know that it provides the opportunity to identify features that are most critical to participants, identify missing features. It also gives us the opportunity to build better acceptance criteria, and it allows us to make changes quite quickly and effectively. So when we look at evaluations, we typically look at two things, and the one is usability testing, the other is expert reviews. So we also know that the lack of evaluation continues to be a large contributor of corporate budget strain. We know that with the lack of early assessment, it can cost quite a lot later on. So this, we know, is a challenge that we face daily. It's something that we normally try to tackle head on. And this brings us to the importance of your US assessments quite early on. So what we like to focus on at Immersion Group are expert reviews or insider reviews. And this really gives us the opportunity to evaluate experiences based on best practice. And what this allows us to do is give it a fresh perspective and understand the product's value to the business. With that as well, it helps you to validate your design and strategic roadmaps. And it's also a quick win with low cost solution. This gives us the opportunity to spot any UX or usability issues before spending money. And it also gets your project going quite quickly. So with clear next steps and clear action points that we can execute. So definitely a bonus. And with that, we know that there's a large library of evaluation techniques and methods with a lot of evaluation tools on the market. There's so many different ways to conduct UX evaluations, and there are so many potential users on the planet that we can evaluate. So bringing back to the topic today, we know that the two main questions that we are magnifying is, what are the challenges involved in evaluating special applications? And then the other is, which enhanced evaluation techniques can we use to overcome them? So we've prepared a couple of cool case studies where we'll go through a couple of these as well, and sticking to sort of the trends and what we're seeing in terms of the future of UX evaluations with some real world examples as well. But please do stay with us until the end of the session as well. We are drawing the winner of the competition, which is a free experienced design practitioner course. We'll draw that at the end. So for now, I'll hand over to my colleague Jeff, who will take you through some really cool case studies.
Cool. Thank you so much, Shaunei, and thanks everyone for making the time to listen. So today I'm really just going to be walking through a project that the team have been working on for the last while in the UK, because it really brings some interesting questions to the fore, which I think are really topical and quite important when it comes to the future of UX and evaluations. So to begin with, is just some context, right? So in the UK, there are around 300,000 health and care applications, and there are hundreds of different types of them. So some are mental health applications, some are for managing diabetes, cancer, senile dementia, arthritis, you name it. And with the sort of plethora of applications, there are many different challenges that start coming up. And they're for the patient, for the clinician, and for the app developers. Now, I mean, ones that we sort of focused in on is, how does the patient know which apps are helpful and which ones are actually safe? I mean, you're dealing with quite, I suppose, high stakes situations when it comes to healthcare, and you have to know that it's safe to use. The other one is, how do clinicians know which app to recommend, whether they should recommend a particular mental health app to one of their patients, or would they actually be causing further harm? And finally, the developers themselves. Now, these hundreds of thousands of apps, how do you stand out? Even if you've got a great product, how do you make sure that you're not getting sort of looked over? So that's where a company called Orca comes in, and our partnership with them. So essentially, they are an app evaluation company, and they came to solve this problem by, looking at things like data security, clinical efficacy, and usage behavior to really give the user and the developers and the clinicians themselves a really good sort of benchmark to work out which apps are great and which ones aren't. And they've been really successful with that. But they realized, there's a gap here, the user experience. Now, I mean, as we all know, the user experience is vital. And it determines a lot of things like adoption of the actual application and therefore the clinical efficacy. So that's where we came into this partnership, and we came really to help them really understand what a user experience evaluation could look like in this really scaled environment, when you're doing thousands of applications. And how do you keep a level of objectivity throughout this process? So if I think about, our sort of typical way of doing this, in the consulting world is quite deep, and it takes, upwards of 2 weeks. And we would really usually look at things like the organization context. We would say, okay, what is the strategy you have for this application? How does it fit into your organization? What is the design process you follow? Is it human-centered? Because that's going to also tell us a little bit about whether it's effective or not. And then we'd have hypotheses that come out of that to understand what the problems could be. We'd also look at things like the actual user context. So, developing personas, understanding the tasks, analyzing the task flow, to really start to understand at a task level how this application is playing out through the lens of a particular user. And of course, we would use, heuristics and go through a usability scorecard type process. Now, all of this is great, but when you're doing thousands of applications, how do you manage that, right? Yeah. So that was one of the challenges. And then off the back of that challenge, there were two further ones that really came to mind. And that was context. So if we think about the different patients that we're dealing with, now you could have people with mental health problems, you could have people with diabetes problems. How do we maintain that level of context? The other thing we had to look at was in terms of objectivity. So their whole system is based on the idea of almost binary questions. So saying, is your data secure or not? How do we maintain some level of objectivity while maintaining the rich insights you get from our sort of expert vantage point? And of course, as I mentioned, the scale component. So the first part is kind of, I suppose, simple, right? If you think about looking at heuristics, there's a level of objectivity in this, in the sense that, there's been many deep studies done by the likes of Don Norman and, others over the years. And there's been a huge body of knowledge to just reinforce that, there's certain principles that are true based on like human factors. So take error prevention, for example. In the real world, if you go to a hospital and you're going to have a leg amputated, you write on the leg, do not cut here, please. Just to make sure that doesn't happen. Yeah. Or in the case of like an application, right, or a medical device, in this case, we're looking at a glucose measurement device, and the point is too small. Now, when that happens, you could completely misread someone's glucose, and you could end up with a huge, health hazard and the wrong diagnosis. So error prevention is just common sense, and as well as aligned to, human fallibility, and it applies for all humans. Now, this becomes a bit tricky when we get more and more specialized. And that's why this talk is really around specialist applications. And one of the apps that we looked at in our sort of testing phase of this collaboration was a mental health application. And this one in particular was developed by clinical psychologists inside of a university. So, you know what, they have a really deep understanding of the user from one perspective. They understand, you know, the emotional, I suppose, context that they're living in. They understand a lot of the behaviors that come with anxiety in this case. When we're starting to try and evaluate this from, you know, a usability perspective, we don't really have that context. I mean, we try to build it, to understand what we can. We you know, go online, we look for things, we do our best to understand what it looks like. But when you get down to the nuanced components, like how would a particular color affect the mood of someone suffering from agoraphobia? Because I mean, there's over sort of 14 different types of anxiety, so that also plays into it. What are the limits of cognitive load? You know, can we treat, you know, it becomes like an accessibility question. Can we look at it from the lens of a normal or I suppose typical user, or is it someone in a heightened state of anxiety? And all of these things start to play a part in how we evaluate. And so I think there's a clear path for this from a UX perspective. I mean, typically what we would do is try and consider the wider ecosystem. We would try and understand the patient, the clinician, any other additional sort of users. We were trying to understand their profiles and abilities, their needs and behaviors, values and beliefs, etc. But we found that that's also a bit of a problem, right? We went through the process of looking at personas, and that's very typical. And we started putting together, you know, personas within different user groups based on the limited knowledge we have. And this brought, you know, an interesting sort of dynamic. And so to solve this, what we did is we brought in subject matter experts. In this case, we're talking about actual psychiatrists and psychologists who are able to help contribute to a persona, who are able to help validate it. Because these kinds of, you know, this kind of information is really out there in their sort of knowledge base. I could go and interview 100 different people suffering from anxiety, and I still won't get the level of detail in terms of the behavior they display, in terms of the motivations behind that behavior, and in terms of what is an effective clinical intervention. So that really rounds it out. And it also makes you think about different industries. You know, this is not just a healthcare problem. If you think about in financial services, for example, you know, we're dealing with some really specialist information in many cases. If you think about, you know, if you're creating a personal financial management tool, you're now dealing with finances. Or if you're creating a robo-advisor for investments, there's a level of specialist and subject matter expertise that needs to be baked into these. So far so good. So we're able to solve the problem of, you know, the lack of, I suppose, context that we have by bringing in that level of expertise. But the next challenge really that we faced was around objectivity. So the current evaluation they have, is, as I said, was really sort of black and white. It was binary. Sorry guys, I'm sure you can tell I'm in Joburg. There's hot cars going everywhere, but be that as it may. Okay, so please bear with. So if we think about, you know, from an objectivity perspective, they were evaluating in a very black and white sort of environment. Now we're talking about expert reviews, and the clue's in the name. An expert review is someone who's had a lot of experience doing these, has seen 1,000 different applications, and is able to apply these heuristics and best practices really well because they've seen it many, many times. For example, if you look at the screen we have here, it's pretty much blank. In fact, it's a timer that someone needs to work with. Now, the UX people in the room will probably recognize that that's, you know, an affordance issue. And that's a leap we sort of make, right? Our brains, you know, we've seen these things many times. We can apply a principle and we can work out where it fits. And we ignore certain pieces of information and we highlight others. Now, that is never going to really be an objective way of doing things. It's really well-founded, but it's not objective. So the conclusion we came to with this sort of constraint was to say, okay, we're never going to be 100% objective on this. And that's for a good reason. The richness that you get out of an expert reviewing something is just is out of it not being a completely binary or yes or no type exercise. If I tell you there's a back button or not, it doesn't really give you much information. But if I tell you, you know, who's suffering from anxiety attack will not be able to work out how to interact with this interface, that's much more useful to a developer or to a patient from an information perspective. And of course, I mean, there might be a future in which maybe artificial intelligence can replace our jobs. But right now, I mean, it's definitely something that is best in the hands of the expert reviewer.
Yes, absolutely.
However, you know, there is still another place where we can add a bit more objectivity in. And that also goes back into the persona conversation. And, you know, there's a bit of work going around the world at the moment on this, and I see there's actually a talk later on, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on it. Also because I don't properly understand it. Because what we found in this process is we said, how do we bake in quantitative data into our persona sets? And we started dealing with some data scientists, some artificial intelligence experts, and started really looking at different ways we can create sort of behavioral dimensions that are off usage patterns. So they would go into the back-end data of each of the applications. They would look at, you know, matching, for example, demographics against usage behavior, creating various clusters, and identifying different, you know, user types within that. And this is really quite important, I think, you know, because as we start propagating these personas, and yes, they've got the validation from the specialists, but now, and then they've got, and then now if we build in the quantitative data, it just becomes a lot more trustworthy. And I don't know if anyone's ever dealt with, you know, multiple stakeholders in any sort of environment. It's always good to be able to back up your qualitative data with quantitative significance. And so this is one of the routes we're taking. Now, you know, we're still on this path at the moment. And as I said, we're looking at the clinical validation of the personas, the quantitative components, and building this into a rapid sort of scalable review process. And we hope to be done with that next year sometime. But, and there's a lot of work still to do. But what is really interesting, I think, and when we talk about future-looking sort of trends and things like that, is there's an interesting factor at play in the UK in particular, where they have, you know, a universal healthcare system. They have the NHS, which really means that data and resource sharing is possible. It means that no one's going to protect, well, as much as in, you know, a private sector, the data that's available. And there's a really interesting, you know, opportunity there that you are able to now potentially create a universal data set for your patients. You're able to create a bank of personas, for lack of a better word, in which you could continuously have a feedback loop, informing them either through quantitative or qualitative data, as well as with the subject matter experts, to make sure that each designer that's working on a particular problem in whatever sort of domain in the healthcare space is working off, you know, some really good data sets. And it just made me really start to think about the potential for this elsewhere. If you think about in South Africa, perhaps, you know, and if you think about outside of healthcare, wouldn't it be amazing if designers were able to work off a common understanding of the user set that they have?
Absolutely.
There, of course, is, you know, we're dealing in really competitive and privatized industries. But I just found that it was a really nice thought, especially in spaces like healthcare, where all of us have a vested interest. And, you know, if we get it wrong, you know, the stakes are really high. And with the wrong data, it could cause real harm, whether, you know, physical or financial. And so I'll just leave you really with that thought. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. And just some final points. I mean, when we look at the future of UX evaluation and where it's going and how we are as an agency, as a consultancy, trying to push the boundaries when it comes to evaluation as well, to make sure we can pull out the best in our clients and make sure that the experiences we're creating does consider the human aspect. So when we consider expert evaluations and expert assessments and expert reviews, insider reviews, Jeff, let us know sort of what is your best approach to starting something like that? What is the new approach to starting something like that?
Well, I suppose from an expert review perspective, the starting point has always been around best practice and looking, but you always start with an understanding of the user, and you create a principle-based way in which to evaluate. So, I mean, for example, at the moment I'm working on we're working on an app for senile dementia. And when you think about things like findability, what does that mean in the case of an elderly person? How do we evaluate it? Are we much harsher on finding things?
Yeah.
Make sure that your I suppose Fitz law is in place, or all of those sort of variants, and you become a bit more stringent on these criteria. So the starting point is really always to have that deep as deep as you can get understanding of that user group, and it becomes more and more true when you're dealing with highly specialized applications like the ones we find in healthcare.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody have any questions in the viewers group that you want to submit for us before we move on to the draw?
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, guys. Thank you for the awesome talk, for the insights shared. Apologies that I was a bit absent a few minutes ago. But we've got one question. Please, guys, continue to add your questions to the Ask a Question component. So the question reads, you mentioned principle-based evaluation. Can you expand on what you mean by that? And that's a question by Vaughan.
Sure, no problem. Thanks, Vaughan. So really, I suppose I'm talking generically around the various heuristics that one can come up with. The original sort of few that came from Don Norman in those days, and they've kind of evolved over the years and had many sort of studies associated to them. The one I sort of mentioned in this talk was around error prevention, for example, and they're basically rules of thumb to say whether to evaluate an interface or an experience, and they've been quite rigorously tested over the years, and have been found to be quite true, and they can give you really early insights in any sort of project. So if you're dealing with an existing application, you can apply these heuristics and really get a good sense of where the application may be failing, so that you can make early changes. Of course, you would really want to be testing it with your actual user group, but that's not always an option that you have. And this is just a quicker and dirtier way of doing it.
Absolutely.
Anything you'd want to add to that, Shaunei?
No, I think you made a very, very good point. And I think as well, with these best practices and with principles and how it's evolving and how new concepts, new methods, new tools that we can use for evaluation are coming out, I think a very strong focus is being made on automation. And with that, I would caution, moving too far into automation, further away from human element, can be a risk that we're taking going into the future. So absolutely, advocates, best practice, advocates of the industry in terms of practitioners, professionals, experts, absolutely pin down the principles of evaluation and stick to your guns. It definitely is best practice for a reason. And for that, we do welcome digital future, of course, but still keep human element front and center in front of any strategy.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I just want to check before we move over to the draw for the winner of that competition.
Yes.
Just checking a few more seconds if there's any other questions from anyone. Again, thank you so much, guys, for the talk, for the time, and for the knowledge. I don't think there's any more questions. So
Cool. So we ran a competition, guys. Everybody who bought a ticket to attend the event has been entered into the draw to win one of the experience design courses from Immersion Group. You can become a certified experience design professional. This is an industry first that we have pioneered. And the exam certification by APMG International. APMG International is a UK accredited certification group where you get issued badges of completion and certification badges that you can share for credibility. This is an online course. It is self-paced. You can do it at your own leisure. So we're giving one of these away to one of the attendees. So on screen, you can see we're going to do the live draw. It's a random selection that I'm going to click. Who could it be? Is it Ricardo? Congratulations. We'll be in touch. We have your details. We have your basic details. We'll be in touch, and we hope that you see the value in the course as we do, and hopefully you enjoy it. We look forward to it. Thank you to everybody for joining us today. If you have any other questions, please let Iggy or you guys know, and we're happy to take the conversation further.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys. Congratulations, Ricardo. I'm sure you'll find a lot of benefit out of that, out of the course. So again, thank you, guys. If you do have any questions, please reach out to Geoffrey and Shaunei.